Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Lloyd Green, who's an attorney based in New York, who was opposition research counsel to George H.W. Bush's 1988 campaign and served in the Department of Justice from 1990 to 1992. And he is a contributing writer at The Guardian, where his latest article is "America's Top Cop is a Right-Wing Culture Warrior Who Hates Disorder. What Could Go Wrong?" Welcome to Background Briefing, Lloyd Green.
Hello. Thank you.
Well, thanks for joining us. And you were in the Justice Department when William Barr was the Attorney General under President George H.W. Bush. And I talked to another member of the Justice Department, Harry Littman, a while back, who was he was actually praised William Barr and seemed to think he was a really good guy. He didn't detect any of the concerns that have been noticed lately about his kind of authoritarian streak. So how did he perform as the Attorney General? Was he the same person back in 1991 and 92 that you worked with? Is that the same person as we see today?
I think in both cases you're seeing someone who reflects the priority of the president who was in office at the time. It also reflects that president's mean. George H.W. Bush was very much a creature of the establishment. The Department of Justice functioned accordingly. He was not into turning things upside down. This president is different, and I think in that sense, Bill Barr is now taking the lead in reflecting the current president's outlook and temperament.
So could you go so far to say then he's kind of a Cardinal Richelieu character, a very competent, smart, savvy operator with a lot of bureaucratic experience who's working for a amateur, somewhat detached, mercurial, and ill-informed president? Does that give him more power and influence simply because the president he's serving is somewhat vacuous?
I think he gains power because you have a president who wants to reach a particular endpoint and doesn't necessarily care about how he arrives at that endpoint. So that ends up making a sharp inside player like Bill Barr a more powerful creature within the bureaucracy and within the White House. You go back to the Bush administration, Bush 41, you had multiple centers of power within the government. Bill Barr was important. Almost by structure, the Attorney General was always important, but there were also other important players. This time out, you may have one or two important players, and in a sense, then everyone recedes. And the wish list of a president is very different. George H.W. Bush wasn't dealing with impeachment. George H.W. Bush was not dealing with potential overseas influence on his administration. Those weren't questions. George H.W. Bush wasn't impeached. There was no special counsel. You can go down the line. In a sense, Bill Barr at that time functioned like a normal Attorney General functions. This is not your typical president. This is not a normal presidency. And you're getting an intersection of the man and the moment with both Trump and with Bill Barr.
So the latest information we have about what happened on last Monday in Lafayette Square, where Bill Barr apparently took charge and cleared the square of protesters in order for President Trump to have a photo op in front of the Church of St. John, which has caused quite a furor and has led to a number of senior military officers openly criticizing the president and even bringing up the specter of authoritarianism. All the while, both President Trump and Bill Barr keep hammering away at this idea that all these protesters are either being infiltrated or manipulated or controlled by this Antifa group, even though the FBI itself says that there's no evidence. And the latest information comes from Eleanor Holmes Norton, the D.C. representative in Congress, who spoke with the head of the D.C. National Guard, who personally spoke with Barr and informed him that the protesters were peaceful. So what is going on with Barr in terms of his morality and religiosity? You know, the eighth commandment says, "Thou shalt not bear false witness." Is he cynical, or does he honestly believe that these protests across the country, in almost every city and every town in the country, are being led by Antifa, and that these demonstrators are terrorists? Does he believe that?
I can only look at the past, and from where I'm sitting, part of this is a replay of his days up at Columbia, where he was among the counter-protesters, counter-demonstrators during the student uprising, and also a replay of the 1992 Los Angeles riots, the first time he was Attorney General. And I think on his part, it's part relitigating the 1960s and also potentially trying to get right what didn't happen in 1992 with the Los Angeles riots. Unfortunately, just because you want something to happen doesn't mean that it will, and just because you wish reality to be one thing doesn't mean that it is actuality. And I think that is colliding with his view on things, and it creates its own disparity between what actually occurred on the ground and what you'd like to imagine as having occurred on the ground. You saw that the other day when he was interviewed this past Sunday, and he was saying, no, pepper spray isn't a chemical weapon, things like that. And it's one thing if a campaign spokesperson says something like that, and so there's an element of discount to that type of thing, as opposed to when Attorney General of the United States says it, and the Attorney General of the United States is the most powerful law enforcement official and the top law enforcement official in the country. And you have to ask yourself, is that where we want to be, where we need to be, where we ought to be? And you reach a potentially different conclusion about that.
And again, I'm speaking with Lloyd Green, who's an attorney based in New York, who was opposition research counsel to George H.W. Bush's 1988 campaign and served in the Department of Justice from 1990 to 1992. And he is a contributing writer at The Guardian, where his latest article is "America's Top Cop is a Right-Wing Culture Warrior Who Hates Disorder. What Could Go Wrong?" Now, back in 1992, here in Los Angeles, during the riots, the Bush administration, George H.W. Bush, deployed Colin Powell. So how do you think Bill Barr feels about Colin Powell now going public in support of Joe Biden and basically saying that the Trump administration have strayed from the Constitution?
If I'm Bill Barr, I am looking at Colin Powell and just saying to myself, I am not necessarily reflective of where the alumni of the Bush 41 administration are. Or I am one reflection of it, but I am not the totality of it, and I think he would be very mindful of that fact. I mean, Colin Powell was someone whose name was bandied about going back to 1988 as a potential vice presidential candidate. Didn't happen, but that was the regard in which Colin Powell had been held by members of the Bush administration. In a sense, Bill Barr has seized the brass ring. The question is, what did he get by seizing it? As far as Colin Powell goes, he has his legacy. He's out there. People will judge accordingly, but I think he sleeps well at night. As for Bill Barr, I can't say.
Right. But Bill Barr has sort of created a kind of puzzlement, and there have been a number of profiles of him recently. And I guess the puzzlement is, why is he doing what he's doing, in the sense that he comes across as a kind of an authoritarian moralist, particularly if you read the Notre Dame speech, and yet he's serving this kind of pornographic president. And it's the same question that's been asked of the religious right in terms of their fidelity towards Trump. But what is the role here of the conservative Catholic group Opus Dei and Leonard Leo?
I can't speak to.
Yeah.
Okay, let's break that down. As far as Opus Dei go, I can't speak to it. I can't speak about it.
Right.
If you're talking about Leonard Leo and the Federalist Society is essentially both a vetting, it has become a vetting adjunct and a battering ram on judicial nominations. And it's no longer simply what I would call a debating society type entity. It's very much involved in the political scrum. And so, yes, in a Republican administration, they end up having, at this point, serious influence. I won't say outsized influence because they're very much in sync with where the GOP is on judicial nominations. If you're asking, well, for all of the expressions of moralism that can surround the right, I think at the end of the day they perceive several things and that make just opting for power as an end in of itself, which isn't to say the left wouldn't do the same thing, but at this point in time, I think they perceive, one, the demographics of the United States are changing. Two, Trump is definitely their opportunity. Three, if you replay the election, looking back in time, the only likely Republican to have been able to win last cycle was, in fact, Donald Trump. And if it means that you end up winning elections with a bull in the china shop, I think the calculus becomes on their end. We'd rather have a bull in the china shop and win than be on the outside with someone who couldn't put a coalition together. So I think you arrive at Bill Barr, and more than that, you arrive at Donald Trump.
Well, I bring up the Federal Society in the sense that I think Trump's legacy will be getting a lot of conservative judges, some of whom are unqualified, on the federal bench, and he's almost breaking the record, I think. It doesn't look as if there's going to be much else of a legacy. So that's why it would seem the question arises, is that the ultimate agenda? In other words, you put up with the imperfections of this man in the Oval Office, but you achieve your goal.
I think that's part of it. The other part is a lot of folks in the Federalist Society predating Donald Trump were there in response to what they saw as an overly active Congress. There was a point in time until, let's say, 1994 when the Republicans took over the House. Republicans placed a tremendous amount of stock within the executive branch because they did not necessarily see control over the Congress as something that was attainable. They also saw the Vietnam War, and the lesson they took from it was that Congress should not be able to muck up the works. And so you ended up coming up with, you could call, an intellectual outlook that sought to bolster the executive. And there you have it. Now, that all having been said, the role of the president has been growing for quite some time before that. The imperial presidency was something that dates back to Democratic administrations. It's something that Republican administrations picked up on. It has to do with the fact that the president is the one official that the country as a whole elects. The other elected representatives represent a state, represent a congressional district, represent a locality, because the president is elected nationwide, and because government has expanded, you have that, if you would, tropism toward just looking at the executive branch as a be-all and end-all. Now, that having been said, conservatives in the past have not accorded the same degree of deference to the president when they're out of power than when they are in power.
Well, let's turn a little bit towards what you think might be in the cards in our future, given the turbulence in the country today, Lloyd Green. Bill Barr's basically got a kind of militia there going in Washington, D.C. without insignias, which troubles a lot of people. In fact, it's provoked some lawsuits. He does echo Trump's constant refrain about Antifa being behind all this, and also Trump continually talks about the Second Amendment, which doesn't seem to be appropriate even when you're holding up a Bible upside down. What does the Second Amendment have to do with all this? These seem to be dog whistles to Trump's base, and the fact that both Barr and Trump continually talk about domestic terrorism, and talk about invoking the Insurrection Act of 1807. What I find disturbing is I spoke the other day to Colin Powell's Chief of Staff, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who was in the government at the time after 9/11 when the Patriot Act was passed, and he said that the Trump administration doesn't need the Insurrection Act. They have secret statutes that were passed in terms of the continuity of government that could be invoked. So how far are Trump and Barr prepared to go in terms of pushing this idea that we have a domestic terrorism and martial law may be needed?
I would break that down into two pieces. So far as domestic terrorism, I think you're going to wind up getting a lot of hype coming from the administration, given the fact that we are in the middle of an election cycle when all of this is happening. This happened with Bill Barr in 1992. They used the Insurrection Act at the invitation, importantly, of the governor of California. That's not playing here. What you may wind up seeing is just the administration trying to actually look at the results of some of the rioting and the looting, which did occur, and saying we now have domestic terrorism as opposed to just we have these incidents and build it up. And I would say that is part of their playbook. Creating their own militia. I don't question that they have and would harness the instruments that they have at their fingers. The question is, to what extent could they do that successfully? You've already seen a lot of the brass take a hard line on the president's use of the military, injecting them into the situation. So on one hand, you don't necessarily rule out on what can go through their minds, what they could pull off. I think that is likely something else. But unfortunately for us, we're in a point in time where we may just say time will tell and not know.
Well, I guess we should stay in touch. What can I say? I thank you very much for joining us, Lloyd Green.
All right. Thank you.
And again, I've been speaking with Lloyd Green, who's an attorney based in New York and who was opposition research counsel to George H.W. Bush's 1988 campaign and served in the Department of Justice from 1990 to 1992. And he's a contributing writer at The Guardian, where his latest article is America's Top Cop is a Right-Wing Culture Warrior Who Hates Disorder. What Could Go Wrong? We're going to take a brief station break and back investigating the possibility of defunding the police and enacting reforms to eradicate the culture of impunity and dominance in police forces.